Hi, everyone. Today we're going to go over the birth of ethnic studies, how students demanded a critical education that they felt that they were not receiving, particularly at San Francisco State University, where ethnic studies was created. So it starts around the 1960s, in particular during this time of the civil rights movement. And this time, November 1968, was a very tumultuous time. The United States was not only experiencing the civil rights movement, but also was 13 years into the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King Jr. had also been assassinated, and the Black Panther Party was demanding systemic change for Black communities who were plagued by poverty and police brutality. So, amid this time, students were also beginning to understand that their civil rights included the rights to a proper education. And at San Francisco State University, there were members of the Black Student Union, which was a student organization, who were also members of the Black Panther Party. So here we can see how civil rights politics, and in particular more radical politics, were beginning to influence young people, particularly Black students here, who were realizing that they were not being given the education that they knew that they deserved. So one of the main problems that we see here was that enrollment rates for minority students at this time had dwindled down to just 4%, even though 70% of students in the entire San Francisco Unified School District were from minority backgrounds. So, meaning, even though the community was largely made up of students of color, hardly any were actually enrolled at the university, which of course demonstrates several systemic issues, from the fact that their community is not being served. Students are not being represented, obviously, in higher education, but also there are access issues. Why aren't students able to access higher education? Well, we know from history that civil rights efforts were undertaken in order to get students to be able to be accepted at universities and enrolled at universities. But because of such a long legacy in the United States of segregation and other measures that made sure that there was not equal access to education, these sorts of historical patterns made their way into higher education, so that students were not being served and many students of color were not able to access those institutions. However, these students were very hungry for knowledge. So Black students in particular were very hungry to study their own history. And the Black Student Union had been pushing the university to create a Black Studies department for 3 years, but administrators had continuously resisted that idea. And you can see here on the screen, there are two members of the first ever Black Student Union in the country at San Francisco State University, who are still alive and do speak about these issues that they experienced when they were younger. Many of the people that I'm going to be speaking about today are still alive and have continued on the legacy of speaking about the importance of ethnic studies. So at this time, there was something that they called the Experimental College, and this was actually a student-run initiative for the BSU, the Black Student Union, to teach their own classes. So at this point, students were so hungry for knowledge that they started to take matters into their own hands, creating their own curricula, their own classes that students took not for any other purpose other than very much desiring to learn about their communities, who they were, what their communities not only have been through, but also what are the things that their communities have contributed to, what are their struggles, what are their triumphs, what are these untold histories. And students didn't just want to learn, untold histories. They actually connected their histories to the ongoing struggle against systemic issues that were plaguing their communities, including poverty, police brutality, and lack of affordable housing. So, in studying these topics, they were also learning about how their own selves are situated amid all of these other interconnected issues, and how these interconnected issues really boil down to systemic racism as well as classism. And by exposing and learning about these systems, they were able to then fight against those things, because when you realize that you see problems happening in your community, but you don't have the language to explain them, or you don't know how these problems have come about, it's very difficult then to address those issues or to make things better. So somebody who was there at the time, and who was one of the initial students who were responsible for striking for ethnic studies, said, quote, "It was an era of young people asking questions and wanting to transform their communities. That impulse, that hunger to transform one's community, is actually what forms the basis of ethnic studies." So here comes sort of this effort for solidarity across racial lines, across culture. And this is the creation of the Third World Liberation Front. So Asian American students as well began wanting classes that spoke to their history and experiences. Asian American students got involved with a student organization called the Asian American Political Alliance, which was one of many ethnic student organizations on campus. And in early fall of 1968, these organizations banded together and formed a coalition called the Third World Liberation Front. So what I mean here by coalition is efforts to come together across lines of difference in order to figure out what these groups had in common so that they can work toward their common goals. So a coalition is a group that's really formed when various people, whether that be different political parties or different committees, different organizations, agree to work together. Sometimes this is a temporary agreement, but they work together in a partnership in order to achieve that common goal. And here, these students all did have a common goal, which was they wanted ethnic studies. So when they created this organization called the Third World Liberation Front, it's important to know that at the time, this was acceptable language. Today, we don't necessarily call developing countries third world countries. That is an antiquated language. Today, we use the word developing, right, or developed nations. But at this time, third world referred to all the non-aligned countries or cultures in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this meant something much more than just countries that were, undeveloped or something like that. Instead, what it really entailed, or what it really sort of embodied, was this sort of grouping, this coalitional grouping together of all of these countries that have faced very similar systems of oppression, including colonial and imperial oppression. And so students in this Third World Liberation Front, even though they came from different cultures, different races, different ethnicities, different areas, what they saw ultimately was what they had in common, which was their united and shared history of, again, different forms of oppression. So that term was meant to inspire solidarity. So one of San Francisco State's most influential anti-Vietnam War organizers was also a popular English professor named George Mason Murray. And he just so happened to be the Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panthers, and of course this would be its own separate conversation, but the Black Panthers were very much a organization that was concerned with social welfare, especially in regard to education. They had a lot of programs that were seen as not just revolutionary, but also very much in service to the community. And so, for example, they had the Free Breakfast for Children program. They also created other social programs within education. They had community health clinics. They had workshops. They had extra classes that people could take to learn about civil rights and social justice. So the Black Panther Party in general, unfortunately, is very much misconstrued most of the time in public memory, but education was a big part of their platform. And students on campus loved this professor, this English professor, George Mason Murray, but his outspoken politics were not so much loved, right? They were not tolerated, especially by San Francisco State administrators. Murray, in a televised press conference, said, quote, the war in Vietnam is racist. It is the war that people like Johnson are using Black soldiers and poor white soldiers and Mexican soldiers as dupes and fools to fight against people of color in Vietnam. So here you can see that he was linking, right, connecting not just civil rights in America, but also the fact that he believed that the war in Vietnam was an unjust and unethical war, that he felt were pitting people of color against other people of color for reasons that were not really to serve those communities, but instead it was doing the opposite. Rather than liberating anybody or helping people at home, it was doing damage in other countries, it was doing damage in our own country, it was doing damage to our own communities, because at the time, and actually historically ever since, Black and brown men in particular are disproportionately drafted into the military. And at this time, it was extra tragic because when those men were drafted and served in the war and came back, they were still treated as second-class citizens because of their racial identities. So at this time, the Board of Trustees forced San Francisco State's president at the time, Robert Smith, to fire Murray on November 1st, 1968. And as you can imagine, this sparked protest. So 5 days later, the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front joined together and went on strike. Murray's suspension was like setting fire to kindling. There were already such rising tensions at the time. So student strikers really wanted the right to define their own educational experience. And together, they drafted 15 demands, including a School of Third World Studies and a Black Studies degree and department. So this was absolutely unprecedented. A student movement like this had never occurred before in this country, and they were ultimately just demanding the right of an education that they felt that they deserved, that everybody needed, right? Not just them. And it was to study topics that not only were about their own communities, but about how many ethnic and racial groups in this country have shared experiences and perspectives, and how our histories affect our present and of course will affect our future, especially if we're able to learn from past historical patterns or issues or problems, then learn the language and tools to speak about those problems, expose those problems, come up with shared solutions, and of course, hopefully craft a more just and ethical future. So these strikers also wanted to raise admission rates for students of color. Again, only 4% of students of color or students from minority backgrounds were enrolled at the time at the university, which is incredibly low, despite the fact that the community was predominantly students of color. So strikers vowed to boycott all of their classes until the school met their demands. So they were coming together, not attending class. They had made their demands, and as you'll see, they made themselves heard in multiple ways. All the while, in the background, as far as the socio-political climate goes in the country, the United States military was disproportionately drafting Black and brown men to fight in the Vietnam War. Now, these men weren't eligible for student exemption if they weren't in school. So this means that their right to an education was a matter of life or death. So the stakes were quite high here when it came to these demands. Now, initially, strikers engaged in acts of disruption that were known as the War of the Fleet, a campaign to, disrupt the normal operations of the school. And so students put cherry bombs in toilets, or they checked out huge quantities of books to overwhelm the school's library system. And while all of this was largely, nonviolent, unfortunately, the school immediately invited police to campus. And by invited, what I mean is that police in full riot gear swarmed San Francisco State. They were armed with 5-foot batons and began gathering and beating students. So students responded by throwing rocks and yelling obscenities at police and administrators. So ultimately, their police presence, especially the presence in full riot gear, escalated the tensions that were already rising, especially because the police presence at this time was very much reminiscent of the ways in which the police force had been used in the past to continuously oppress people of color, in particular Black Americans at this time. Again, remember, this is during civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. had already been assassinated. The Black Panther Party was growing, as well as the sort of political hatred for the Black Panther Party for what they stood for. So police ended up escalating the tensions here on campus, creating a battleground that ultimately became bloody. Many white students at this time who were white allies joined in this fight. So especially the white radicals who followed the lead of strike leaders like Crutchfield. So they believed that without ethnic studies, they themselves had also been denied a proper education. So they didn't feel like these classes were just for, right, students of color, but instead they felt that without learning that history, they too had been cheated out of a proper education. And their support intensified as the strike dragged on and the violence continued. So a month into the strike, teachers also joined with demands of their own. And as tensions escalated even more, President Smith shut down the school indefinitely. So imagine you are going to college or university and this large social movement erupts. In the middle of it, the entire school shuts down. No contingency plan, no plans to move forward, no thoughts on addressing the situation, just everything completely shuts down. And because of that, President Smith resigned in December of 1968, which is just 1 month after this all began. Now, in his place, the board appointed S.I. Hayakawa, an English professor. And Hayakawa was popular with conservatives in the Sacramento area, but he was extremely unpopular with student strikers. And their confrontations were heated and frequent. Protesters called him the puppet. They felt like he was just a puppet or a mouthpiece for a particular political agenda. And that agenda, of course, was to ensure that the students did not get their demands met. Now, strikers ignored Hayakawa's ban on gatherings. And so because of that, he felt the need to continue to use force, in particular with the police force. Penny Nakatsu was protesting on January 23rd, 1969, in what many call the mass bust. And she gives us insight into what that day was like. She says, quote, 2 lines of police came up. They surrounded over 500 people who were there for the rally and trapped all of the individuals who were caught within a human net. Police also charged at the students. And Akatsu said it was one of the bloodiest and most frightening days of the entire strike. Quote, the power of the state was trying to literally beat down the strike and strikers, she said. It was literally a practiced, orchestrated military movement. At this time, hundreds of protesters were arrested, backing up San Francisco's court system for months. Students, faculty, and members of the community were also affected. So all of these students who were there for this rally were basically gathered up in a net, like you would see in a commercial fishing net or something, and taken into custody. Now, at this time, there were so many different groups that were coming together in regard to their demands being met. So as you can see here, all of these pictures came from the 5 months that students spent striking. So you can see the Black Student Union, the Asian American Alliance, as well as several other groups here. You can also see the police in their full riot gear marching on campus. But ultimately, the fight for ethnic studies was a fight of coalitional politics, of different people across lines of difference coming together in an effort to have their goals met, have their education be properly embedded in the curricula for all students to learn, to benefit, to grow, to reflect on the past and the future. This effort of solidarity is really at the heart of what ethnic studies is about, what ethnic studies as an ethos, as a belief, and as a system is really about, what it's for. And efforts of solidarity continue within the field of ethnic studies all the time in this field. So ultimately, the strikers prevailed. And after 2 more months of striking, Hayakawa and strikers negotiated a deal on March 20th, 1969. So at this time, the school agreed to accept virtually all non-white applicants for the fall of 1969 semester, which is a huge accomplishment, and to establish a College of Ethnic Studies, the first in the country, with classes geared towards communities of color. But get this, Hayakawa gave the student strikers the job of designing the entire curriculum from scratch in just a matter of months. So when I say that the birth of ethnic studies was for students by students, this is what I mean. The students created the first ethnic studies curriculum, and the College of Ethnic Studies was ready by fall of 1969. So ethnic studies was officially born. And it's really interesting to think about because it wasn't just a class, it was an entire college, right? So at different colleges and universities, especially at universities, you have different colleges, such as the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts, the College of Mathematics, etc. And now at San Francisco State University, they had an entire College of Ethnic Studies with all different departments, including Black Studies Department, Latinx Studies Department, Asian American Studies Department, American Indian or Native American Department, etc. And this was the first ever ethnic studies program, ethnic studies college in the entire United States. It remains today and offers many ethnic studies courses at San Francisco State. And one of the protesters who was there gave an interview and said, quote, "Ethnic studies is a way of embracing all of the cultures that make up the world. If we don't understand each other, how are we going to get along? Ethnic studies is something that's important, not just for people of color, so we know about our histories and cultures and destinies, but for all people." Now, the struggle does continue along with the triumphs. There are still many concerted efforts against teaching ethnic studies, and some of these reasons are politically affiliated. So some people unfortunately believe that ethnic studies is something that's largely negative or something that teaches students to hate America, which is, again, unfortunate and a misconception of what ethnic studies is. Some people just feel uncomfortable talking about these topics, race, class, oppression, etc., and therefore believe that we shouldn't talk about them. Of course, that's also a really misguided thought process, because not talking about something doesn't make it go away, nor does it make it better, nor does it help us learn or grow in the future. Other people believe that ethnic studies is about dividing people and pitting people against each other. Of course, as you just saw and just learned, the history and birth of ethnic studies is completely the opposite of that. It's all about solidarity and coalitional politics, and the idea that we need to come together across lines of difference to understand our shared experiences, worldviews, perspectives, histories, legacies, etc. Now, one amazing triumph that happened recently was that recently the state of California passed AB 1460, which is, I'm sure you all have heard of this, the new requirement that all students, K through 12 students, college students, university students, to graduate with a degree in the state of California must take an ethnic studies course. This is a completely unprecedented triumph in regard to our field. Now people have to take these classes. And of course, anytime there is a mandate in place, meaning that everybody has to do something, there's always going to be detractors who do not believe that we should, have to take these things. And while it does make sense that everybody should be able to take the classes that they want, there are already many mandated courses across universities and campuses. For example, most universities, it's mandated to take a public speaking class. Most universities and colleges, it's mandated to take a science class, a math class, a language class, and so on and so on. That's what makes up our curriculum. And so ethnic studies is just added to that list. It is not adding extra hours for people to complete their degrees. It's actually rearranging other requirements. So it is not something extra that you have to do now. It was built in. So the same amount of hours would be required. They took something out and added this in instead. It's interesting to see how this will play out in the future. But across campuses and colleges and universities in California, ethnic studies has already been shown to make large improvements in people's understanding of themselves, their own communities, and the communities that they live in, with the people with whom they share space, with whom that they share many different aspects of life. So hopefully through this, lesson of the birth of ethnic studies, how ethnic studies began, is helpful in understanding where you as an ethnic studies student stand. You are somebody who has inherited this legacy, somebody who benefits from the largest, most intense, and longest student strike that ever was in this country, all to fight for ethnic studies. And here you are today taking this class.